do I have slide at the end? So hi everybody. Today I'm going to talk about Perl 6 phasers. So what are phasers? Now you know in Perl 5 you've got the begin block and the end block where you can put some code in and it will run like immediately at the beginning of compilation and at the end and all this kind of stuff. So phasers are a bit like that, but there's more of them. Lots more of them.
Isn't that Perl 5 got more?
Yes, exactly. Well, Perl 6, Perl 5 got more. So you've basically got various different phases of execution where you can have phases. Now, one difference between a Perl 6 phaser and a Perl 5 special block is that the phaser doesn't have to be a block. It can just be a statement. So in this case here, the init statement there will run at code initialization and store the time. And then when that same block is, well, that save statement is then got to, it will do the minusing from the time that it's stored initially and take it off the current time. So it's a really quick and dead easy way of doing throwing in some benchmarking code into your stuff. So yeah, begin, check, init, enter, and a couple of other blocks will all store values that you can then access at runtime, which can be quite helpful. There are a few that you can't do as statements.
Is there a technical term for a block or statement?
No, not really.
I'm sure I've heard lost at some point.
What?
Lost?
No, but we can use that. I'll try that. Is that like Porsche?
It's like a blast phaser. I think it was kind of that sort of thing.
Possibly. I've not heard that. I'll just say the block or statement because it makes more sense than the I do live a hundred existence. Can I carry on? So yeah, program execution, you have, the four phases here are pretty much the same as the ones you got in Perl 5. The one difference being the check block, which has the same kind of functionality as the unit check block, which is added in 5.10, because the check block in any version of Perl 5, kind of runs at the end of the whole compilation cycle, whereas the unit check runs at the end of each module's compilation. And it was designed to actually mirror the check block in Perl 6. Yeah, so you've got begin, check, these run during compilation step, begins running at the beginning, checks piling themselves up and then running off at the end. And again, with the init runs at the beginning of runtime, and the end blocks run at the end of runtime again, piling up and then coming in first in, first out. Last in, first out. Important thing to bear in mind, if you're dealing with Perl 6 modules, the modules are pre-compiled, generally, which means that they'll be compiled down to bytecode, and any blocks that you have, or any begin or check blocks you have, will be pre-compiled at that step. So if you put in a begin block with a time in it, then you will not be dealing with the time that you run the program at, you'll be dealing with the time that you compiled the module at, and potentially when you downloaded it and stuff. Occasionally that can be good. I mean, it does mean that you can put begin blocks in where you're checking your operating system and just having whole chunks of code that will just be thrown out by the compiler because you have an if block that's wrapped in a begin that's like, well, yeah, brain suddenly gone crazy. But yeah, you can basically short circuit a whole load of code by going, if this is on Windows, do this, if it's on Linux, do this, and then do that in begin block so that it will just throw it away because it will go straight to that. Don't need it. The VM and the compiler are both quite smart like that. The next level phases, this is new, block level phases. So every chunk of code in a block, and this includes the outer block of a script that's like not obviously there but does exist, has a number of phases that run. So they kind of run in this order. It looks like the other. So you've got the pre-block. Now the pre and the enter block, initially when you look at them, it took me a little while to work out why have we got these two blocks? They do the same thing, but they don't. Because the pre-block will throw an exception if it doesn't return true. So it's a precondition check. If you come into your block and your pre-block and your pre-phaser returns false or null, then boom, it throws an exception and the rest of your block doesn't happen. Then you have the enter block, that runs at the beginning of the block. The leave block runs at the end. Quite useful if you want to, for instance, open a file handle and make sure it closes at the end of the block. You can put the close the file handle in the leave straight after opening it, which is similar to how Go does a lot of file handling type stuff. And then the keep and the undo block. So you've got leave, always runs when a block exits. The keep and undo will run depending on whether or not the block successfully exited. So basically returns a value, a null value, and doesn't throw an exception. And the undo is where if you've got an unsuccessful block. I cover those a little bit more in the next slide. And then you've got post, which is similar to pre in that it is a post check and will throw an exception if for any reason it returns false. Yeah. So a bit more detail on the leave, keep, and undo phases. So yeah, the undo and keep, if you throw an exception, won't happen. If your block returns undefined, then the undo phaser happens. If your block returns a defined value, then the keep phaser happens. And again, just allows you to occasionally play around with I covered this just before, but here's a vaguely useful use case for the pre-block. This code won't run except for during working hours. Because the first thing it does is check to see if the current time is between 9 and 5. Because nobody wants to run code after 5 o'clock even if you're still in the office. Using the Perl 6 chained operators there, because why the hell would you want to do an AND and two checks? That's just crazy to me. And again, post condition, you can have a post condition block that throws an exception if for any reason the rest of the code has gone crazy and such. So yeah, can be useful. Oh yeah, here's one. I knew it. So in this case, this one's going to throw an exception if your block has taken too long. So if at the end of it it's got past, it's taking more than 2 seconds to run, it's going to throw an exception. Might be. I was reaching a little bit, I'll admit, when I was coming up with this example. But like I say, this was after I'm like, what is the difference between these things? Oh, wow, that's kind of cool. Loop blocks. So when you have a loop, so we're talking a for while loop. Loop is an actual construct in POSIX. Then you've got 3 additional phases. You've also got all the block level phases. So you've got an enter phaser that will fire every time you go into the block. The enter phaser every time. But then you've got the first phaser, and that only fires on the first thing. So you can initialize stuff in the first phaser if you want to. The next phaser, end of the loop before you leaves, will not trigger if you leave the loop through some other way than a next. So normally, like if you get to the end of the loop, or if you use a next, then the next phaser will trigger. But if you accept out or you use last or something to leave the loop, then the next won't trigger. Instead, the last will trigger. This does lead us on to another thing here. Notice it says next exception. So this is where I found out something really interesting about Perl 6 that I didn't know, which is there are 2 types of exceptions in Perl 6. You've got general exceptions, which I mentioned a second, which are just you call a die, or you create an exception object and you throw it, or all this kind of stuff. Your standard exceptions you expect in pretty much any language nowadays. Then you've got control exceptions. And since March this year, so the 2019.03 release of Perl 6, pretty much all of the control sort of handling within the language is handled with exceptions. So if you return within a function, that actually triggers an exception that the VM handles to then pass back the results and stuff. So it basically means there's a unified system of doing stuff based on exceptions, with just a certain set of them being specific, like built-in ones. So it's like next, last, undo, redo, return. These all throw exceptions, which I thought was quite weird and kind of cool because it just simplifies things. The interesting bit is, press the wrong button again, that, did I mention it here? I mentioned it. Oh. There's a control phaser. There's a catch phaser, which will catch general exceptions. And there's a control phaser. So you can actually, if you want, write code that will handle control control exceptions and like manually handle the control. Which there kind of has to be because Perl 6 is mostly written in Perl 6. And then some not quite Perl underneath. So this thing has to exist. It's kind of cool. Yeah, the catch exceptions rate catches all the general exceptions. There is also a try block. So you can do just like if you want to do exception stuff, you can do try. And what try will do is makes failure objects automatically fatal. So a failure object is created when you do something that is bad but isn't like immediately going to blow things up. So for instance, dividing 1 by 0 doesn't immediately kill a Perl 6 program. Trying to do anything with that result will kill your program because the thing you get back is a failure, and then when you try and do something with a failure, it will error. But for instance, you could correct that failure out. So there are certain cases where failure can be quite useful. Well, try block though will immediately make failures error. But then a try block also has a catch block in it built in that will catch any exception that no other catch block catches. So it's like the last catch block in try block. And it will silently drop them. So a try block kind of works like val does in Perl 5 in that you can blow stuff up inside it and then outside dollar underscore will be set and you can look at dollar underscore and go, oh, something went wrong, dollar bang. Yes, not
something went bang.
Yes. So sometimes that's what you want to do, is just throw a try block in which case you don't need a catch block. But you can put a catch block inside the try block to catch specific exceptions that you want to be able to handle, and then you can let the rest go out to dollar bang. That's kind of so there's 3 phases linked into asynchronous program flow when you're playing around with supplies mostly, and there's also a little bit to do with, in fact, it's pretty much all to do with supplies. So you've got the last phaser when your supply ends, the quit phaser if your supply craps out for some reason apart from just normally ending, and you've got a close phaser which you put within the supply for when you close it. So you can do some stuff. At some point, I really should do a talk on this, but quite frankly, if you're interested in Perl 6 asynchronous stuff, just look at the talks that Jonathan Worthington's done on it, because they're awesome, and they really give you the idea of how it all works, and he's so much better at it. So yeah, if you're interested in it, I really advise you. Yeah, he did one at the most recent Perl conference in Riga. Yeah, there's also doc phases, because when you run Perl 6 in document mode and it's processing POP, it's still actually a language. It's not. It handles POP totally differently. It's actually kind of like running it through in a language kind of mode, and you can have phases in it. So you can stick doc in front of a begin check or init block, and it will run it only in document mode. I'm not 100% sure why you do that. You can. Yeah, and it's all linked into the fact that you can attach documentation directly to functions and stuff using certain comments. Oh yeah. So anybody who knows all of their Perl 5 phases will have noticed that CHECK and AUTOLOAD. So the Perl 6 CHECK phaser maps to the Perl 5 unit check phaser, not Perl 5 check, because it doesn't make sense in the way that Perl 6 does compilation, especially with precompilation, to have the check phaser running at the end of the whole thing. And there isn't an auto-load block. Instead, you've got a fallback method on classes. So you can effectively, it's a method rather than a special subroutine, because Perl 6 has actually got methods instead of just jamming subroutines into bless things. I think, yeah, because I kind of threw this one together quite quickly. Because I've been not feeling great mentally for a little while, but one of the great things about working here is that they're really helpful about things like that. So. Yeah, so that was me. That was it.
It was very well timed, that was 15 minutes on the dot.
See?
So you have
That's it.
time
1 minute per slide. So,
if you would like.
questions?